Hello students, myself Sibi Manoj from MIT College Alandi. Today I am here with you all to discuss about the chapter on human reproduction. We have already finished with 2 lectures on the same. Right now I'll start this lecture with the topic on menstrual cycle. Now when we start with this about the menstrual cycle, first of all I'd like to explain you those 4 phases in menstrual cycle. As you can see here, the cycle, it begins with, the first is menstrual phase, which is, you can see that on your right hand side over here. This menstrual phase is then followed by follicular phase, which is also called as proliferative phase. And then it's been followed by ovulatory phase or ovulation phase. And the fourth and the last phase of menstrual cycle is luteal phase, or you can call this as secretory phase. Each one of the phase will be discussed with you all in my later slides. But before we start with the actual menstrual cycle, I would like to introduce to you with some terms involved in this. Now let's see what are those terms, and then if you want, I can come back to the same slide. There are some terms which are involved in this menstrual cycle, or you can call ovarian cycle. The terms are, first of all, menarche. What do you mean by menarche? Menarche is nothing but the time of puberty and the period of the starting phase of menstruation. The first day of menstruation in a female is called as menarche. This menarche, it links with the word puberty. Now, what do you mean by puberty? Puberty is nothing but the age in which the female has got some changes in its internal reproductive organ reaching maturity. That's what menarche is. It is the beginning of the childbearing period. N number of hormones are involved in this, which are nothing but the gonadotropins hormones, which stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete various hormones like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. The period or the age of puberty, it varies from 10 to 14 years. Now this is about puberty. There's one more term used over here in menstrual cycle is menopause. It is nothing but the ceasing of menstrual cycle. That is, it is the end of the childbearing period. It is usually in an age group of 45 to 50 years. But normally these days, it even occurs at the age group of from 40 to 45 years. It is because of the stress, our day-to-day living style, our food that we take, the fast food that we take, all this has got a deep negative effect on our hormonal system, on which the whole menstrual cycle depends. The menopause gradually becomes less responsive, or during menopause, the ovaries becomes less responsive to the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and that's the reason why menstrual cycle becomes irregular and stops during menopause. This menstrual cycle takes place in primates like monkeys, apes, and humans. And the menstrual cycle, it lasts for 28 days. Next, what is the next thing now? The next thing is there are large series of events which takes place in this ovarian cycle after every 26 to 30 days throughout the childbearing period of about 32 years. Now, let me have the next slide. As you can see, there is a flow chart given over here. This flow chart, it represents the whole and soul of this menstruation cycle. How does the menstruation cycle goes on? Why does the menstrual cycle takes place? The answer for that question is nothing but this flowchart. First of all, there is a organ, there is a part in our brain which we call it as hypothalamus. This hypothalamus secretes a hormone called as gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, which is the full short form abbreviation of gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. This GnRH will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete some of the hormones. Those hormones are FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LHS, that is luteinizing hormone. This FSH and LH are the two hormones which will act on the ovary. And how will it act on ovary? Let's see. Ovary is made up of large number of follicles. The first follicle is primordial follicle. Then it goes on changing into different stages. We have already seen this in our previous lecture. So primordial follicle is then converted into primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and then it reaches the mature graphene follicle. The mature graphene follicle then ruptures, giving rise to ovum. That is what we have studied in the previous lecture. That is what is called as ovulation. Now, this FSH full form is follicle stimulating hormone. That means what does it do? It acts on the growing follicles which are present on in the ovary. So this growing follicle is stimulated by this follicle stimulating hormone, which in turn will secrete an hormone which is estrogen. This estrogen level will be increased because of more amount of FSH. But at a certain stage, at a certain level, it will show a negative feedback on this FSH, which is secreted by this pituitary gland, because a body has got a normal level of certain hormones. If that normal level is exceeded, it will show its negative or positive feedback. Now, in this case, the estrogen level is increasing. This estrogen level, when is increasing, shows a negative feedback on the pituitary gland. So the follicle stimulating hormone is depleted after a certain level. At the same time, this is luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing, it is something linked with corpus luteum. Now, what is this corpus luteum? Corpus luteum is nothing but after ovulation, that is after the release of the ovum from the mature graphene follicle, whatever is left other than the ovum is nothing but corpus luteum. This corpus luteum will act as a temporary pregnancy hormone, and this will secrete one more hormone which we call it as progesterone, and along with some estrogen. That means corpus luteum is acting upon by this luteinizing hormone to secrete progesterone along with some amount of estrogen. Now, even progesterone has got a certain negative feedback on the pituitary gland as well as on hypothalamus. Progesterone will increase level of progesterone as well as estrogen after ovulation period will inhibit FSH as well as LH secretion. That means the amount of FSH and LH will be decreased due to more amount of progesterone and estrogen. But at a certain time, increased estrogen level in the middle of the cycle, increased means more than required, it's a tremendous increase in estrogen that will stimulate the LH secretion, that will stimulate the secretion of FS and LH. When it is more in amount, more than that means it is more than what is present over here, where the negative feedback takes place. That means there will be negative as well as positive feedback depending upon the amount of estrogen and progesterone secreted by the ovary. This is what is the hormonal control over the menstrual cycle. That means the hormonal control starts from the hypothalamus part, which secretes GnRH. This GnRH that in turn will act upon the pituitary gland, will secrete FSH and LH, and FSH and LH in turn will secrete will stimulate the ovary to secrete estrogen and progesterone. What is next slide? That's what it's a continuation of our previous flowchart. In this, we are mentioning something about menstrual cycle hormones. There are some hormones already mentioned which are involved in the ovarian cycle. The first one is FSH, that is follicle stimulating hormone. This is secreted by pituitary gland. Now it is follicle stimulating hormone. So as the name suggests, it promotes the development of the follicles in the ovary. At the same time, it helps in stimulating the estrogen secretion by the follicular cells present in the ovary. One more hormone, which is a luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing hormone is also made by the pituitary gland. This pituitary gland, this hormone secreted pituitary gland will promote ovulation because it's luteinizing hormone, something related with corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone will act on the Graafian follicle to release the corpus luteum. Because once ovulation started, or during the 14th day after ovulation, when the Graafian follicle ruptures, it releases ovum. At the same time, the leftover part of Graafian follicle with those blood clot is nothing but corpus luteum. And at the same time, it promotes the estrogen secretion by the developing follicle. It helps to secrete the estrogen by the follicle cells. Next, after LH, it is estrogen. Who makes estrogen? It is nothing but the developing follicle and corpus luteum in the ovary. It helps in what? It helps in thickening of the uterus lining. Now, which uterus lining? Is it the endometrium or myometrium? It is nothing but the endometrial lining are thickened because of the presence or secretion of this estrogen hormone. At the same time, already mentioned, when the level of estrogen is increased to such a level more than normal, it inhibits the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. At the same time, it stimulates the pituitary to secrete the luteinizing hormone. Now, progesterone. The next hormone is progesterone. This progesterone hormone is made by corpus luteum. And corpus luteum is formed after ovulation. So I can say progesterone hormone is secreted after ovulation because progesterone hormone is a pregnancy hormone. Obviously, there's no requirement of this progesterone to be secreted before ovulation. So that means after ovulation, the amount of progesterone is increased because corpus luteum is the one which is called as a temporary, it secretes the hormone, pregnancy hormone temporarily. Next, it also maintains the endometrial lining of the uterus. The thickening of the endometrial lining is maintained by both this hormone, estrogen and progesterone. Now, why the uterus lining has to be thickened, or why the endometrial lining has to be thickened? The reason is uterus is the one which is the site where implantation of the fetus takes place after fertilization. After fertilization, the embryo is obtained, the zygote is formed. That zygote is being implanted in uterus, that too in the endometrial lining. So this endometrium, it acts as a cushion, or it also secretes glycogen. It shows presence of glycogen. Glycogen is the one which will give nourishment to the developing embryo. So now, after ovulation, the uterus gets thickened. That means it is ready to house the zygote until and unless the fertilization takes place. If fertilization does not take place, the same thickened endometrial lining will start degrading or degenerating. That means the funeral of the uterus takes place. The uterus starts crying. That is what is the bleeding of the uterus takes place, which is nothing but we call it as menstrual cycle. This takes place only when the ovum released after ovulation does not undergo fertilization. And the fertilization, if it has to take place, the ovum is viable only for 24 hours. So if the fertilization has to take place, the the fertilization, if it has to take place, it has to fuse with the sperm within 24 hours. The sperm, it is viable till 48 hours. But the ovum, after release, is viable or functional only for 1 day or 24 hours. Within 1 day, if the fertilization does not take place, then the next menstrual cycle takes place. And that is nothing but the bleeding of the thickened endometrial lining. Fine. Now, what is this actually? What is this other flow chart in front of you? This flow chart is nothing but ovulation phase. When I'm talking about ovulation, I mean to say there is a release of ova in ovulation. That means a primary follicle which is present in the ovary is converted into secondary, tertiary, and then converted into the mature graphene follicle. And this mature graphene follicle undergoes ovulation, giving rise to ova or the egg. And after the release of this ova, whatever product obtained other than ova is nothing but corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is acted upon by the hormone luteinizing hormone, which is nothing but which secretes the progesterone, which is a temporary secretes the pregnancy hormone. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the actual menstrual cycle. What is it all about? If you can see, initially when I started with the lecture, I said that there are 4 phases. One is the menstrual phase, second is a follicular phase, or you can call it as proliferative phase. Third is the ovulatory phase, and the fourth one is a luteal phase or secretory phase. If you can see over here, there are some days given, 0 days, that is the starting of the the menstrual cycle, 14 days, then 28 days. It's a 28-day cycle. After 28 days, the next cycle starts. The next menstruation begins. Now in this, these are the days, 0 days. Now from first day till I will count from the first day, to the 4th day is the first phase, that is a menstrual cycle. That means till here, till the 4th day is a first phase, menstrual cycle. Now what happens in this 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 days, or till the 4th day of the menstrual cycle? If you can see over here, in the first 4 days, which we call it as a menstrual phase, which is also called as the bleeding phase. In this case, what happens? The ovum is not fertilized. That's the reason why menstruation takes place. The ovum is not fertilized. So what happens? The high level of progesterone. Now, when you can see over here, there are some changes taking place. This is a uterine cycle. This is the ovarian cycle. This is the pituitary hormones. This is the body temperature during our menstrual cycle. And this is again the ovarian cycle they are showing over here. Now, in this case, what happens during the first 4th day in the first phase of menstrual cycle? This is a uterine cycle. The bleeding takes place over here. You can see here, the bleeding starts over here. Now then the bleeding starts over here. This hormones which are present over here, what happens? What is the level of the hormone? Estrogen and the progesterone. Estrogen and the progesterone level, they are at a normal rate. Estradiol is nothing but estrogen. At the same time, the pituitary hormones, that means which are the pituitary hormone? One is the luteinizing hormone, another is a follicle stimulating hormone. Even they are at a normal rate, because if they are increased, then only our estrogen, progesterone will be increased. Even they are at a normal rate in the initial stage. And what happens with the body temperature? Body temperature also a little bit normal. It is at a, what do you call? It's they are about 25 to 27 degrees Celsius. Then what happens in this ovarian cycle? This is nothing but in our ovary, in the female ovary. This is a growing follicle. Now inside is the primary oocyte, if you can see over here. Now these are the changes: primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle. Then what do you call? Primary, secondary, tertiary, and this is our Graafian follicle, which is ruptured, a mature Graafian follicle which is ruptured and releasing ovum. And this is what is happening in the first till 14 days. But we are discussing about only the 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 days in the beginning of the menstrual cycle, where the bleeding takes place and the hormone levels in both cases, FSH, LH, as well as in the ovarian hormones, they are at a lower rate. But this menstrual flow now is also described as weeping of the uterus for lost ovum or funeral of the unfertilized egg. Okay, now what is in this menstrual flow? There are some secretions from endometrial glands. You can see this. This is the lining of the uterus, which we call it as endometrium. So the secretion of endometrial glands are present in the blood, that is the bleeding portion. Then cell debris are present, blood, unfertilized ovum, everything is present in the bleeding during the first 4 days. When the amount of progesterone decreases and stimulates anterior pituitary to secrete FSH, and proliferative phase begins. So this, the second phase, which we call it as follicular phase or proliferative phase, it begins. And here thickness is only about 1 mm in this case. Thickness of what? Thickness of the endometrial lining. Just 1 mm. Because the bleeding or the disintegration takes place of the endometrial lining. Now what happens is, now let's see the second phase, that is the proliferative phase or the follicular phase. That is, it should be starting from the 4th, I meant to say 5th to 13th day is the follicular phase. Starting from 5th to 13th day is nothing but the second phase or the follicular phase. Now why it is called as follicular phase? What is the reason behind that? Follicular phase, it's called as because the primordial follicle, that is this, the primordial follicle of the ovary, it develops into this Graafian follicle. That's the reason why it is called as follicular phase. Next, what happens over here? If you can see over here, this level of estrogen slowly increases. At the same time, progesterone level is as it is, because till now no ovum is released, but the estrogen level is increasing. Next, what happens with this? The follicle stimulating FSH, if you can see over here, the FSH level is slightly increasing, and this increase in FSH level, ultimately it gives rise to secretion of estrogen by ovary. Next, what happens before ovulation? Estrogen level is increased because of FSH increase. At the same time, what happens? The ovum starts coming out of the Graafian follicle on the 14th day, which is nothing but called as ovulatory phase. That is, ovulatory phase is nothing but the ovulation, the process, the time during ovulation process, when the Graafian follicle totally disrupts, giving rise to burst open, giving rise to ovum. Now here on the 14th day, you can see this is the 14th day. What happens during this 14th day? Here in this case, the estrogen level is at its peak, but at the same time, why is it at its peak? The reason is the hormone, which are the pituitary hormones like LH and FH. You can see the LH level is tremendously increased during the 14th day because LH, which is a luteinizing hormone, is the one which will stimulate the formation of corpus luteum. Because of increased level of LH, the ovulation has taken place on the 14th day with the release of the ovum. That is why the LH level is shown at the peak or surged during the 14th day with the increase in the estrogen level by the ovary. Next, at the same time, the follicle stimulating hormone is also increased on the 14th day because it is stimulating the follicles to undergo ovulation. Later, what happens is, after 14 days, after the 14th day, the third phase is, I mean to say the fourth, because 14th day is what? The ovulatory phase. That's what is the 14th day of the menstrual cycle, which is the ovulatory phase. Now, what is this fourth phase? It's nothing but the luteal phase or the secretory phase. What happens during this luteal or the secretory phase? It starts from the 15th day to the 28th day of the menstrual cycle, 15 to 28. Now, what are the changes that takes place during this luteal phase in the ovary, the ovarian hormones? What happens during this, what do you call this, luteal phase? The amount of hormones, just check out the ovarian hormones. This is nothing but the progesterone which is secreted by the ovary. So this progesterone level is increased during this 14 to 28 days period. At the same time, estrogen level is also increased, but progesterone level is increased more as compared to the estrogen level because progesterone is one which is secreted by this corpus luteum. So corpus luteum is acting as a temporary placenta because it secretes progesterone till 3 months till the placenta gets developed. And once the placenta gets developed, corpus luteum is disintegrated. There's no role of corpus luteum at that time. The role of corpus luteum is only for 3 months from the beginning of the pregnancy. And once placenta takes a role, the placenta starts secreting the pregnancy hormone, which we call it as progesterone. And then this is the estrogen level, which is also secreted by the ovary, is also increased. Now, what is happening over here? Progesterone secretion is under the influence of luteinizing hormone. It also helps in this, progesterone also helps in the maintenance of the thickness of the endometrial lining. So it is called as pregnancy hormone. Next, corpus luteum also secretes a hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin. Human chorionic gonadotropin, which is HCG, and is similar to LH, which is a luteinizing hormone. Abortion can take place if corpus luteum becomes inactive before the formation of placenta. That's about 3 months of pregnancy. That's the reason why this corpus luteum is called as a temporary pregnancy, secreting temporary pregnancy hormone. Now, what happens with this corpus luteum if the ovum is not fertilized? Now, all this takes place when the ovum is fertilized. The cushion for the, what to say, for the zygote is ready now because the endometrial lining are thickening. They are into the thickening of the endometrial lining takes place. So glycogen is secreted for the nourishment of the embryo. Suppose if the ovum, that this ovum which is released, it is not fertilized, then what is the situation? If this ovum release is not fertilized, this corpus luteum will degenerate, and this will result into corpus albicans, which indicates that fertilization has not taken place. Fine. That means the bleeding starts again the 28th day. That is what is showing over here. The menstruation takes place again after the next 28 days. What is this menstruation again? It is nothing but disintegration of the endometrial lining. Till here, the endometrial thickening, the thickness of the endometrial lining is increasing because the uterus doesn't know whether the ovum is going to get fertilized or no, but it is still ready for the zygote, for housing of the zygote after fertilization. But once the corpus albicans is formed, what happens here is this particular endometrial lining gets disintegrated, which results into bleeding, and that is nothing but called as menstruation. Now, during this phase, after 28 days, if you can see, again the level of the hormones, progesterone, estrogen, which is dependent upon FSH and LH, is decreased over here. At the same time, if you see, the body temperature is again decreased over here. It is rising in the phase of luteal phase, somewhere over here. And this corpus albicans formation is nothing but there is no fertilization of the ovum. That is, what happens over here is after 3 to 4 months, placenta starts secreting the hormone progesterone to maintain the thickness of the endometrium, and the corpus luteum starts degenerating. No shedding of endometrium or menstruation takes place during this time. So the missing of the menstrual period is a first indication of pregnancy. Next, now what happens in the uterus? What are different changes which takes place in the uterus? Uterus, the corpus luteum, which is found in the ovary, they secrete progesterone, and that helps in the growth of the endometrial gland. This endometrial gland secretes a fluid which is rich in glycogen for nourishment of the embryo, which is called uterine milk. The thickness of the endometrium takes place. There are changes. Thickness increases from 5 mm to 6 mm. If fertilization occurs, then the embryo is implanted in this thickened endometrium. If fertilization does not take place, the disintegration of the endometrial lining takes place, results into the next menstruation cycle after 28 days. That means the whole menstruation cycle depends upon the hormones which are secreted by the pituitary gland, stimulated by hypothalamus, by GnRH. This is all about the menstruation cycle, in which there are 4 phases, starting from menstruation till the what we call luteal or the secretory phase. That's all for today's lecture. Meet you for the next lecture. Thank you.